Thank you very much indeed, Patricia, for that introduction. And it's great, thanks to the OECD for organising. It's great to be here with so many friends and former colleagues. I have slides, which I'm not seeing just at the moment, but there we go, they're starting up. So when I was asked to talk about why we measure competition, I decided to take that fairly literally. Patricia's quite right. It is not something typically that we directly observe. So I may be more thinking about, well, what could we do and what benefits would we get if we actually could measure competition, perhaps a little more directly than some of the ways in which we normally do. I can have my first slide, please. And it might be quite surprising to an outsider to the profession that we struggle a bit to measure competition, because the word competition pops up all the time in our work. And I would distinguish two very different purposes for which we'd want to measure it. One is what we might call the day job, the legal processes applying the law. And there, you know, we're looking for a significant lessening of this thing, or a significant impediment to effective competition, or even an adverse effect on this thing. So presumably we can get some handle on what it actually means in some way. And then also, and this is probably today's focus, we're concerned with the policy process. We want to understand whether pro-competitive intervention is needed because there is a lack of competition in some sector or even at the country level, or indeed to assess what kind of benefits we would get from making the sector or the country somehow more competitive. And then perhaps being able to assess whether our policy interventions were effective in spurring competition. But can we actually measure it? I think here I want to draw maybe some parallels between the day job, between measuring it in the legal cases that we do and these more policy-oriented purposes. So I can have the next slide, please. And I've expressed this as a process, thinking about the, sorry, no, next slide, please. Thinking about the process that we go through in a competition case. You could think of that as being this machine, this process, which takes a bunch of inputs, which will be facts relevant to the case, and then churns away and then produces some outputs. And the outputs are things we would expect to be good for consumers. This process is a process of what I'm calling rivalry here, and that at the heart of it is competition. But we often don't measure that directly. What we do instead is we look at the inputs and outputs. Next slide, please. So in a merger case, for example, what we classically do is we consider a change to concentration, which is on the input side of my process. And then what we're trying to determine is whether there will be a bad outcome for consumers. Prices rise, output falls as a result of that change. But this is where the link starts to become very important between the two, because just because we can establish, for example, the change in the number of firms or other measures of concentration in the market as a result of the merger does not get us to understanding whether prices will rise. As you all know, even if everyone's agreed on market definition and what the changes are, there is then a debate to be had on whether or not that has an effect on competition. And you will get people from firms like mine coming in and saying, well, this is one of those industries in which actually you can have quite highly concentrated markets and there's still a lot of competition, or you might doubt that, and you might argue that it's the sort of industry where actually quite small market shares and increments can lead to problems with competition. So there is a black box there, which is how we translate those inputs into outputs, and that involves some kind of understanding of competition. Similarly, next slide, please. If you're in an abusive dominance case, then again, you've got some sort of inputs where in particular, as well as the necessary condition of dominance, you're looking at the conduct, you're looking at the behavior of the firm. But again, we don't actually say that there's an effect on competition unless we can actually make arguments as to how that affects the process of rivalry in the market, with the key decider there being whether welfare is in some way harmed as a result of the conduct. This is often misunderstood, especially by people outside the profession, that our consumer welfare standard or any kind of welfare standard is not there as a value judgment about what we think is important and who we think is important. It's actually there as the decision standard to decide the difference between good competition and bad competition. Good competition, for example, in predatory pricing cases, there's obviously a reduction in price, and we only consider that to be anti-competitive if we expect that the resulting loss of competition actually means that consumers be worse off in the long run. So again, we pair together these inputs and outputs, and we talk of it and argue about what that process in the middle is actually doing to translate the one into the other. Next slide, please. And sometimes we can measure these things reasonably well. What is it we're really trying to get at when we talk about competition? I think it's something to do with incentives. Rivalry is maybe a feeling within the firm that we're considering, a fear of losing their markets, the prospect of significant gain if they were to compete harder against their competitors, for example, if they were to reduce their prices. So there are ways we can get a handle on that, and that's particularly around measuring elasticities and critical loss. Although even there, that only really works for unilateral effects cases. In unilateral effects cases, a competition authority will be worried that even if prices change, not much will happen to demand, whereas there's the whole area of collusion, of course, where you just worry that the prices won't change in the first place because they've been fixed between the parties. But elasticities probably don't give us much of an easy route into finding a good solution to measuring competition at the policy level. They require lots of data. They really only work at the product level, or conceivably at the level of the firm. There are some indicators, as we'll hear, that have to do with effectively the residual demand that faces the firm. But in general, these things are difficult to measure, and frankly, even in intensive competition investigations, we really only infer them. So can we use summary measures to infer rivalry at the industry and national level, like we do in the cases? And is there any aggregate way somehow to measure rivalry? Next slide, please. This is where I trespassed a bit onto Steve Davies's presentation, but I think the two of us are largely in agreement. So I've described some different things we could do in a policy sense to measure competition here, maybe starting at the ones at the top, which have the weakest link to actual rivalry as a process in the way that we really want to get a handle at. And I would suggest that as we go down this slide, you're getting more of a sense of what's really going on inside that black box, that process of rivalry competition. So the first one is just purely measuring what I called in my previous slides, the inputs, in particular concentration measures. There is so much wrong with this, especially they are not exogenous for an industry and for the long run. Concentration is exogenous. You can take it as given in a particular competition case because there is the state of the market. And especially in a merger, there is a change in concentration, and that is an exogenous change in the market. But that is very different from looking at a market which is concentrated and saying, oh, well, then there must be a problem, in the same way that you might find a problem when two firms have merged to artificially create that concentration, if that concentration has arisen fairly naturally as a result of consumer choice. And we'll hear more about that. And of course, there's many, many practical problems as well. And perhaps the biggest one, as we will doubtless discuss, is that antitrust markets are different from the sorts of industries that we can typically get data on when we're doing these policy studies. And that, to my mind, really calls into question any significant use of those measures. So just looking at inputs alone isn't enough, and we know that. We know that because from our casework, we know that you cannot simply say, well, this is the concentration in this industry, so that's all I need to know. If we can't say that in a case, I don't think we should be saying it in aggregate, and particularly because there's then heterogeneity in the data. These things don't even add up to a single simple, clear number. So then we can measure what I've called the relationship of inputs to outputs. You can look at a change, and then you can actually find some effects that we might expect to come from competition. That is certainly better than just looking at what's happening on the input side. It's better still, going on to the third point here, if you can actually identify some kind of competitive mechanism. So you're not just saying, well, there was this policy change and then this good thing happened, but where you can actually see that the reason why the good thing happened maybe did actually relate to an improvement of competition. For example, if we see new firms enter. Fourthly, and I think quite a lot of the things that are going on at the moment started to look at this, and I think that's really exciting. We can try to measure things that actually reflect that process of rivalry more directly. Profitability, there's all sorts of issues around measuring profitability. We can talk about those, but especially dynamic measures such as churn. I don't know about you, but when this was all kicked off, maybe with the Council of Economic Advisors report to President Obama in 2016, they had various measures of what they thought seemed to be going wrong with the US economy. I have to say that when they presented the C50 statistics for what was going on at sectoral level on concentration, I was utterly unbothered and unexcited about that because it seemed to me a completely meaningless statistic. But when they had the statistics that entrepreneurship and entry and churn in American industries had declined, well, that seems to me to be rather more unambiguously a piece of bad news about competition. So very interested in those measures, those more dynamic measures. And then just at the bottom, I would mention trying to get inside the box, measuring things that reflect the process of rivalry and also relating them to outcomes in a way that almost tells a story. Next slide, please. So I'll give you an example of that. This is very, very old. I mean, it's only about 12 years ago the paper was published, but it relates to data from the 1990s. So this isn't telling us anything about what's going on right now. But quickly, because I am over time, C and Kleno went off and measured productivity at firm level in a number of countries, including, for example, India and the United States. And what they found was that there were just as many highly efficient Indian firms as there were highly efficient United States firms, but that India had this huge kind of fat tail of really inefficient firms. And they related that to less competitive product markets within India than in the United States. And that work has been extended, for example, by John Van Reenen and his team, who are actually relating those findings to the management quality. They've got questionnaires that try to measure management quality in these different firms. So they're reaching inside the box. They're telling a consistent story about how here is how a policy level problem creates a lack of competition that leads to bad outcomes, which is low productivity. And they're doing that looking at this very heterogeneous data, individual firm data, to get there, reaching inside the box. But of course, you can only do that as a sort of case study. It's not likely to be something that's going to give you a regular indicator. And my last slide, please. Just to take a slightly different tack, we're going to hear about a lot of these indicators. We've been hearing about some of them this morning. I just want to make the point, makes me feel very old to have to say this, that this has been going on for some time. I participated in a study that tried to create empirical indicators for market investigations in 2003 that was published in 2004 in the United Kingdom. And you've seen there are these other indicators, some of which I've listed there, and there are probably others as well. I think it's very important not to think that all this is completely new. And I'm not saying that to criticize it. I'm saying that to try to encourage people to actually pick up on the previous work, because these indicators are only going to be useful if we can calculate them consistently year to year and if we can track them over time. So I wonder whether there have been any studies of policy impacts of these indicators that were constructed before. Maybe even it's time for an ex post evaluation of all of those. But anyway, we will hear about that sort of thing, and we will hear about what is going on from the authorities. But before then, I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel. Thank you all very much.